At 58, Gordon told his wife he needed to work at least 7 more years because he'd read somewhere that a comfortable retirement required $3 million and his accounts held just under $1.4 million. He kept working, stressed and increasingly resentful of a job he'd wanted to leave for years, chasing a number he'd never actually calculated himself, simply absorbed from a magazine headline years earlier. His sister Ruth, retiring the same year at 61 with $980,000, less than a third of Gordon's target, and even less than his actual balance, sat down with an advisor, calculated her real annual expenses down to the dollar, and confidently retired that year, never once worrying she'd chosen an arbitrary number too small to support her. The gap between Gordon and Ruth isn't unusual, and it points to one of the more expensive mistakes in retirement planning, one that costs people something far more valuable than money: years of their working life spent chasing a number that was never actually calculated for their specific situation in the first place. Surveys on retirement expectations consistently find that when Americans are asked how much they'll need to retire comfortably, the answers cluster around large, round, headline-friendly figures: $2 million, $3 million, sometimes higher, numbers that bear little relationship to any individual's actual spending, expected Social Security income, or paid-off housing situation, and instead reflect vague anxiety and numbers repeated in media coverage rather than genuine, personalized math. The actual calculation almost nobody runs for themselves is far simpler than the anxiety-inducing headline figures suggest, and it starts with a single, well-established rule from retirement research. A portfolio can typically sustain an annual withdrawal of roughly 4% of its starting value, adjusted upward for inflation each year, with a high probability of lasting 30 years across nearly every historical market period studied. Applied honestly to an individual's real expenses rather than an arbitrary target, this transforms the entire question from "how do I reach some enormous headline number" into "what does my actual life cost, and does 4% of my current savings, combined with Social Security, cover it?" Ruth's real annual expenses, calculated carefully with her advisor, came to $54,000, including a paid-off house, modest travel, and healthcare costs before Medicare eligibility. Her $980,000 portfolio, under the 4% guideline, could sustainably generate roughly $39,000 annually, and combined with an expected $19,000 in Social Security starting at 62, comfortably covered her actual expenses with margin to spare. Gordon, still working and delaying retirement by 7 additional years chasing his imagined $3 million target, had never once sat down and calculated what his own real annual spending actually was, or what portion of it his existing $1.4 million, closer in real terms to what he actually needed, could already sustainably support. The reason Gordon's imagined number was so far off from his real requirement traces back to a well-documented psychological pattern called anchoring, where an early, often arbitrary number, absorbed from a headline, an advertisement, or a casual comment from a coworker, becomes the fixed reference point against which every future decision gets measured, regardless of whether that original number had any real connection to the specific person's actual circumstances. Gordon's $3 million had come from a single magazine article he'd read in his 40s, a generic, one-size-fits-all figure intended for a broad national audience, with wildly different expenses, paid-off status, and retirement timelines than his own, and he'd carried that arbitrary anchor for over 15 years without ever recalculating it against his actual life. None of this means the 4% guideline should be applied blindly without any adjustment, and treating it as a perfect universal formula carries its own real risks. Someone planning a retirement lasting 40 years rather than 30, someone retiring directly into an unfavorable market sequence, or someone with significant uncertain future healthcare costs may reasonably want a lower, more conservative withdrawal percentage, closer to 3.3% to 3.5%, to provide additional margin for those specific risks. The number isn't magic, it's a well-researched starting point that still requires adjustment for an individual's specific health, longevity expectations, and risk tolerance, not a number to apply mechanically without any thought at all. The deeper mistake Gordon made wasn't choosing a target that was too conservative in an abstract sense. It was never calculating a target specific to his own life in the first place, substituting a generic headline figure for the actual math his own situation required, a substitution that cost him years of continued work in a job he actively disliked, chasing a cushion of additional money he had never actually confirmed he needed. Financial planners who work specifically with pre-retirees report this pattern constantly. Clients delaying retirement by years, sometimes with real personal and health costs from continuing to work, chasing an arbitrary number that turns out, once actually calculated against real expenses, to have already been reached years earlier. The retirees who navigate this well aren't the ones who save the largest possible number before ever stopping to check. They're the ones who calculate their real specific annual expenses honestly, including healthcare, housing, and the lifestyle they actually want. Apply a reasonable, adjusted withdrawal percentage to their actual savings, and treat that calculation, rather than a headline figure absorbed years earlier, as their real target. For some people, that number turns out to be higher than they expected and genuinely requires additional years of saving. For others, like Ruth, it turns out to already be within reach, sometimes years earlier than an arbitrary anchor number would have ever suggested. Gordon eventually did the calculation Ruth had done years earlier, sitting down with the same advisor his sister used, and discovered his actual number, based on his real expenses and expected Social Security, had been reached nearly 3 years before that conversation took place. He retired 8 months later, not at the $3 million he'd spent over a decade chasing, but at $1.6 million, the number his own life had actually required the entire time. 3 additional working years spent chasing a figure he'd never once calculated for himself. Years he now describes, quietly, as the ones he regrets most. Retirement success isn't about chasing the biggest number.